The first thing fleet analyst Sorvith noticed was the smell. Not the ship, not the weapons, not the tactical formation that made no geometric sense by any doctrine she had studied in 40 years of interstellar service. The smell, carried through the atmospheric exchange manifold when they opened the docking collar to receive the human delegation. Something burnt, something biological, something that had no business being present on a vessel that, according to every sensor reading Sorvith trusted, was winning. She logged it as a contamination anomaly and moved on. She would spend the next 11 months wishing she hadn't. The Keth Dominion had cataloged 412 spacefaring civilizations across the Orion Arm. Of those, 31 had achieved what the Dominion classified as Tier 2 military capability: sufficient weapons, sufficient fleet doctrine, sufficient strategic intelligence to pose a meaningful threat to established order. Humans, at the time of first formal contact, had been assessed as Tier 4, pre-strategic, emotionally volatile, technologically adolescent, capable of interstellar travel the way a child is capable of running, technically functional, wildly uncontrolled, dangerous primarily to themselves. The Dominion's assessment board had been unanimous. Sorvith had been the only dissenting note, not because she believed the humans were stronger, because she had read the histories, and the histories all shared one pattern the assessment board kept classifying as irrelevant. Humans never stopped. Not when they were losing, not when they were outgunned, not when the mathematics of survival had collapsed into something no rational species would continue to call mathematics. They kept moving, kept adapting, kept making decisions that looked like desperation from the outside, and only later, sometimes years later, revealed themselves to have been something else entirely. She had written that observation into her formal dissent. The board had noted it, thanked her, and filed it. 3 years later, the Erath Collective's frontier stations began going dark. Nobody blamed the humans immediately. The Erath were not well liked, a mercantile empire that had built its commercial dominance through what it called aggressive acquisition protocols, and what every other species called piracy with better paperwork. Their frontier stations were far out, poorly defended, located in sectors that 3 separate civilizations maintained quiet territorial interests in. There were obvious suspects. The Keth sent a standard observation vessel. It returned with footage Sorvith watched 4 times before she believed what she was seeing. The station at Erath Marginal 7 had not been destroyed. It had been methodically, surgically, almost patiently disassembled. Power cores removed without detonation. Communication arrays taken intact. Hull plating stripped in sections rather than blown. Whoever had done this had not wanted to destroy the station. They had wanted everything inside it. Resource harvesting, the assessment board concluded. Primitive opportunism, a desperate species cannibalizing what it cannot build. Sorvith had looked at the footage again, the precision of the cuts, the specific components taken, the ones left behind. She had requested a list of what was missing from Erath Marginal 7's inventory. The board said the list was not relevant to the threat assessment. She pulled the list anyway. Every missing component had one thing in common: not power generation, not weapons, not navigation. Communications. She filed an urgent addendum to the threat assessment. The board reclassified humans as Tier 3B, an improvement, they said. Progress on your part, Sorvith. She did not feel like it was progress. 6 weeks later, the first human fleet appeared at the edge of Keth-monitored space, and Sorvith got the call that would define the rest of her life. "They're asking to negotiate," said Commander Yeld, his mandibles cycling through a pattern Sorvith had learned to read as controlled anxiety. He was standing at the head of the operations table, aboard the asterisk patience of accumulated authority, the Keth Dominion's finest diplomatic warship, and he was holding a translated message cylinder as though it had personally offended him. "What are their terms?" Sorvith asked. "That's the anomaly." He set the cylinder down. They haven't stated any. She looked at him. They want to negotiate without terms. They want to meet. They want to talk. They say, he glanced at the cylinder, they say they want us to understand something before things go further. Before things go further, Sorvith repeated. Their words. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the observation port, the human fleet held position with an absolute stillness that no fleet in her experience ever maintained voluntarily. Fleets moved. Fleets adjusted. Fleets demonstrated their capabilities through the language of calculated repositioning that every spacefaring civilization understood. This fleet simply held still, and the stillness was somehow louder than any maneuvering would have been. Tell them we'll receive a delegation, she said. Standard diplomatic protocols. And if they refuse the protocols, then we learn something about them either way. They didn't refuse, but the delegation that came aboard through the docking collar was not what Sorvith expected, and the smell came with them, burnt, biological, present in a way that made her environmental sensors register, and then, confusingly, clear. The human leading the delegation was named Sergeant Major Alina Vasquez, and she was the wrong kind of person to be leading a diplomatic delegation. Not because she was hostile. She wasn't. Vasquez moved through the corridor of the asterisk patience of accumulated authority with a quiet, unhurried attention that Sorvith initially read as caution and slowly began to revise as something else. Her eyes, small by Keth standards, fixed forward, expressively mobile in ways that unsettled some of the crew, tracked everything without appearing to track anything. She listened to the translation feed through a small device in her ear, and responded with a slight delay that Sorvith eventually realized was not processing time. Vasquez already understood more of the Keth language than she was demonstrating. The second human, a young man called Tors, carried a case. He set it on the diplomatic table without being asked, without ceremony, and sat back. "Thank you for receiving us," Vasquez said through the translator. "The Dominion extends customary welcome," Commander Yeld replied, following protocol. "We invite you to state the purpose of your presence in monitored space." Vasquez looked at the case Tors had placed on the table. Then she looked at Sorvith, not Yeld, with an expression Sorvith could not immediately classify. "We came to explain the Irath stations," Vasquez said. The room went quiet. "That was yours," Yeld said. "It was not quite a question. We want you to understand what we took and why." Vasquez opened the case herself. Inside, arrayed with a precision that felt almost ceremonial, were components Sorvith recognized. Components from the Irath station inventory. The communications array pieces, the signal processors, the relay modulators. "We didn't take these because we needed them," Vasquez said. "We took them because they were being used to track our movements in sectors the Irath have no legal authority to monitor." She paused. "We're here because we want to show you what we found inside them." Tors opened a secondary compartment in the case and placed a small data chip on the table. "That's a Keth encryption signature," Sorvith said quietly before she could stop herself. Vasquez looked at her again. "Yes," she said, "it is." The diplomatic meeting lasted 9 hours. Sorvith spent most of it simultaneously listening and running calculations in the secondary processing thread she'd learned to maintain during complex negotiations. Vasquez was not aggressive. She was not threatening. She presented the evidence of Keth signals running through Irath infrastructure with the calm, thorough specificity of someone who had been building this case for a very long time and wanted to make certain it was understood correctly. The implications were significant. The Keth Dominion officially maintained no relationship with the Irath Collective. Officially. After the delegation returned to their ship, Commander Yeld turned to Sorvith and said, in a low voice, "They've been watching us." "Yes," she said. "For how long?" She thought about the first Irath station going dark, the 6 weeks before the humans appeared, The methodical precision of the disassembly, not desperate resource harvesting. Evidence collection. Careful, patient, deliberate documentation. Long enough, she said. That's not an answer, Sorvith. No, she agreed, it isn't. This was the first time she felt it, the sensation that would become familiar over the following months. The sense that she was understanding the situation more clearly with each new piece of information, and simultaneously realizing she understood it less. Every answer Vasquez had given them was technically complete, and somehow left the actual question untouched. What were the humans planning? Not the station raid. That was finished. What were they planning now? They had come with evidence of Keth wrongdoing, and they had presented it politely, and they had made no demands, and they had returned to their fleet, and the fleet had remained absolutely still outside Keth-monitored space as though it had all the time available in the universe. Sorvith spent 3 days reviewing everything the Dominion had on human behavior, human history, human military doctrine. She was looking for the precedent, the pattern that would explain what they were doing. She didn't find it. What she found instead was something that should have been more reassuring and wasn't. The humans had, in the past 2 years, resolved 7 separate territorial disputes, not by fighting for territory, but by presenting evidence of violations to third-party mediating bodies and allowing the legal process to run. 7 times, against 7 different civilizations. They had won all 7. They had not fired a single weapon in any of them. They're litigating, she told Yeld on the 4th day. The station raid wasn't a resource grab, it was discovery, legal discovery. They're building cases. Yeld processed this. Against whom? Everyone who wronged them, she said. Every border violation, every ignored treaty. Every time a more powerful civilization moved against them and assumed they weren't watching. She paused. The Erath were just the filing cabinet. The evidence was meant for us. Why? She had no answer. That was the problem. She had the what. She had some of the how. The why remained closed. It remained closed for exactly 11 more days, at which point everything changed, and Sorvith finally understood that she had been asking the wrong question entirely. The communication came from within the Dominion itself, not from Vasquez, not from the human fleet, not from any external source. It came from the Keth Administrative Archive, flagged by an automated irregularity alert that no one had checked in 6 years because the alert category had been considered obsolete. Someone inside the Dominion's own infrastructure had been sending compressed data packets to an unregistered relay for 3 years. Small packets, irregular intervals. The kind of pattern that looked like background noise unless you were specifically looking for it, or unless you had been provided the encryption key that would make the noise resolve into language. The encryption key had been on the chip Vasquez gave them. Sorvith sat with this for a long time before she called Yeld. She sat with it because she needed to understand it fully before she spoke it aloud. Because once she spoke it aloud, the situation became something different. She had spent her career navigating complex political environments by being very precise about when she allowed information to become real. The humans hadn't come to negotiate. They had come to deliver a message to a specific person inside the Dominion, using the Keth's own formal diplomatic protocols as the delivery mechanism. And the Keth, the Dominion's finest diplomatic warship with its best analyst aboard, had let them do it. She called Yeld. There's a source, she said. He went very still, inside the Dominion. Inside this ship, she said. The silence that followed had a specific texture, not the silence of shock. The silence of a very intelligent being rapidly running through every interaction, every conversation, every briefing of the last several days, trying to identify the shape of what had been happening around them. How long have they had contact with someone aboard? He asked. At least 3 years. She paused. Possibly longer. The relay wasn't created for this mission. It predates our awareness of them as a significant actor. They were cultivating a source inside the Dominion before we knew they were watching us. Yes. Before we classified them as Tier 3. Yes. She heard him breathe, a slow, deliberate cycle of the Keth respiratory system that corresponded roughly to what she understood humans called a long exhale. Sorvith, he said, if they've had a source inside Dominion communications for 3 years, what do they know? Everything we discussed about them, she said, every assessment, every internal debate, every decision we made about how to respond to them. She thought about the assessment board, the filing of her dissent, the unanimous classification of Tier 4. They know how we see them. Do they know that we know about the source? Not yet, she said. Another silence. This one had a different texture entirely. Then we have a window, Yeld said. Yes, she said, a small one, she paused. The question is what we do with it. She already knew what Yeld was going to suggest. He was a commander. Commanders had a predictable response to intelligence breaches, containment, counterintelligence, controlled information release. She also knew, with a certainty she couldn't fully justify, that doing what commanders did in this situation was exactly what the humans expected them to do. She requested a private communication with Vasquez that evening, not through official channels, through the docking manifold's maintenance frequency, a narrowband channel that was technically open but practically never monitored, because nothing of significance was supposed to travel through it. Vasquez answered on the second ping. You found the relay, Vasquez said, not a question. This morning, Sorvith said. How long have you known about the source? I haven't confirmed it's a source yet. A pause. Sorvith, Vasquez said, I know your name because our source told us you were the only person aboard that ship who would eventually make this call. So let's not waste each other's time. The use of her name without title, in a language that was not Vasquez's native language, through a channel that was not supposed to carry this conversation. Sorvith found she was not offended. She found she was, for the first time in this entire encounter, slightly afraid. What do you want? Sorvith asked. The same thing you want, Vasquez said, for the Dominion to understand what it's doing. A pause, and to understand what we're doing. Which is what exactly? The answer Vasquez gave her was not the answer she expected. It was not a demand. It was not a threat. It was not even precisely information. It was a question. How many civilizations? Vasquez asked. Do you think the Dominion has assessed as Tier 4 in the last 50 years? Sorvith knew the number, 31. How many of them, Vasquez asked, still exist? The answer was 9. She confirmed it herself that night, running through the full archival record with a thoroughness she hadn't applied since her early career, because some part of her had already known what she would find and had spent years not looking directly at it. Of the 31 civilizations classified Tier 4, pre-strategic, emotionally volatile, technologically adolescent 9, remained as recognized political entities. The others had been absorbed, fragmented, economically collapsed into dependency, or simply ceased to produce the kind of political coherence that warranted a continued entry in the catalog. None of them had been destroyed outright. The Dominion did not destroy. The Dominion managed. She sat with the number 9 for a long time. Then she thought about what Vasquez's question had actually asked. Not how many existed, how many still existed, the present tense, as though the question of continuation was ongoing. Vasquez knew about the 31. She knew the survival rate. She had come to the asterisk patience of accumulated authority with evidence of Keth wrongdoing in hand, and she had given it politely and made no demands and returned to her fleet. The evidence was not leverage. Sorvith had been reading it as leverage since the beginning, and it was not. It was something else. She opened the chip data again, the communications intercepts from the Erath stations. She had spent the first review looking at what the data contained. She looked now at something she had moved past too quickly: the metadata, the timestamps, the routing paths. The intercepts did not just show Keth signals running through Erath infrastructure. They showed the same signals running through 8 other networks, 8 other civilizations' infrastructure, all of them operating as invisible relay points in a communications web that the Dominion had built, incrementally, over the course of 30 years. She found the other 22 non-surviving Tier 4 civilizations in the routing maps, not as current participants, as historical nodes, relay points used during periods when those civilizations had still been coherent enough to have infrastructure worth using. The Dominion had built this communications web by moving through Tier 4 civilizations in sequence. It used their infrastructure while they were viable. When they ceased to be viable, when they were absorbed or fragmented or collapsed, it moved to the next. It was not a conspiracy. It was not even deliberate, exactly. It was the accumulated weight of thousands of small decisions made by administrators who had never looked at the whole pattern. The humans had looked at the whole pattern. They had been looking at it for 3 years from inside the Dominion's own architecture, and they had come here not to expose it, not primarily, but to make sure that one person aboard this ship saw it clearly. Sorvith stared at the screen for a long time. Then she understood the smell from the docking collar, the burnt biological smell that her sensors had logged and cleared. She found the environmental data from that moment and ran it through the full chemical analysis suite rather than the contamination filter. Adrenaline, cortisol, the chemical byproduct of sustained high-stress response in human physiology. The delegation had been terrified when they came aboard. They had been terrified, and they had hidden it completely, and they had conducted a 9-hour diplomatic meeting and delivered their evidence and maintained the appearance of absolute calm. And Sorvith had not seen it because she had been looking at their tactics when she should have been looking at them. She was back on the maintenance channel before she'd consciously decided to be. "You were scared," she said, "when you came aboard." A pause from Vasquez's end, longer than the translation required. "Yes," Vasquez said. "Of us. Of making a mistake." Another pause. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "We've been building this case for 3 years," Vasquez said. "We've had one shot at presenting it to someone who would understand it rather than suppress it. If we'd misjudged the person or the timing or the approach," she stopped. "Yes, we were scared." "But you came anyway." "Of course we came anyway." Vasquez's voice carried something that Sorvith's translator flagged as mild confusion at the nature of the question. Scared doesn't mean stop. Scared means pay attention. Sorvith thought about her dissent, filed and thanked and archived. She thought about what it had cost her politically to put it in writing. Small costs by any measure, minor professional friction. "Who else knows about the routing map?" she asked. "Your fleet command." "Yes." "And if I suppress this, if Yeld decides to suppress this, what happens?" The pause this time was different, shorter, more deliberate. "We make it available to every Tier 4 civilization currently in the network," Vasquez said. "All 9 remaining ones. Simultaneously." She paused again. "And we make it available to the Tier 2 and 3 civilizations whose infrastructure borders those nodes, with context." Sorvith processed this. "That destabilizes the entire Orion Arm Trade Network." "Yes," Vasquez said, "it does. Your fleet would take significant losses in the resulting conflict." "Probably," Vasquez said. "You would take them anyway." "Yes." "Why?" Sorvith asked, not strategically, not diplomatically. She wanted to understand. "You survive the current arrangement. You're small enough that the web doesn't need you yet. You could wait. You could continue building cases. You could." "We could wait," Vasquez said. "We're good at waiting. You have no idea how good we are at waiting," she stopped. But the 9 civilizations currently in the network don't have the time we have, and we are not willing to watch something happen to someone else that we have the ability to stop. That's not, she paused, and Sorvith could hear something in the gap that the translator couldn't quite render. That's not something we're built to do. Watch and calculate and wait while someone else disappears. Even if stopping it costs you significantly. Especially then, Vasquez said, because if it doesn't cost us, it means we didn't really try. Sorvith brought the full analysis to Commander Yeld the following morning. Everything, the routing map, the 31 civilizations, the survival rate, the chemical analysis of the delegation's stress response, the maintenance channel conversation which she had recorded and flagged for official log. She presented it in sequence without commentary and let him move through it at his own pace. She watched his mandibles. She watched his eyes. She watched the moment midway through the routing map when he stopped processing and simply looked at the data. "How long have we been doing this?" he asked, not aggressively, not defensively, with the specific tone of someone asking about themselves. 30 years of documented relay construction, she said. The pattern is probably older. Did anyone intend this? No single person constructed the whole map, she said. Each decision was individually justifiable. The sum is something no individual decision-maker ever looked at. He was quiet for a while. Outside the observation port, the human fleet continued its stillness. She had stopped finding the stillness unsettling. She was beginning to understand it. It was not the stillness of patience. It was the stillness of an organism that had learned to hold everything motionless while one critical function operated at full intensity, because that was how you survived when you couldn't afford to waste anything. "What do they want?" he asked. "They want formal recognition of the 9 surviving Tier 4 civilizations as independent political entities under Dominion protection, rather than managed dependencies. They want the relay infrastructure transferred to a neutral administrative body. They want independent audit access for the next 20 years. She paused. And they want the threat assessment system restructured. The what? The tier classification system. They want civilian representatives from classified civilizations to have formal input in the review process. He turned to look at her. They want a voice in how we categorize them. They want everyone to have a voice, she said, including the ones who have already been absorbed, retroactively. He was quiet again. Then, what do they get if we refuse? They get to be right, she said, about what happens next. She did not say, and they are prepared to be right. She did not say, I spoke to their delegation commander at 3 in the morning through a maintenance channel, and she was calm, and she was clear, and the certainty I heard in her voice was not the certainty of someone who thinks they can win. It was the certainty of someone who has decided how much they are willing to lose. She didn't say any of this because she thought Yeld was intelligent enough to infer it, and because she needed him to reach the understanding himself. He did. They'll actually do it, he said. Start the disclosure process, accept the conflict. Yes. Even though their fleet is significantly outmatched, if 3 or 4 Tier 2 civilizations respond militarily. Yes. He stopped. How do you negotiate with that? How do you apply pressure to a party that has already calculated the worst case and accepted it? You don't apply pressure, she said. You change the calculation. By agreeing. By agreeing, she said, and meaning it. He looked at the routing map for a long time. Get Vasquez back on the formal channel, he said. Official protocols this time. A pause. Tell her the Dominion is prepared to enter structured discussions. She'll know we've reviewed everything. Yes, he said, let her know. What came next was not simple. Sorvith would have been suspicious of simple. The Dominion's administrative apparatus did not respond well to the proposed restructuring. 3 senior council members requested Yeld's immediate recall. 2 of them had personal stakes in the trade networks that ran through the relay infrastructure. One of them, Sorvith eventually learned, had been part of the original system designed 30 years ago, not with the intent to harm, not with full awareness of the pattern he was helping create, but with enough awareness that the disclosure was personally catastrophic. The council vote to begin formal discussions passed by 2 positions. The margin terrified her after the fact. 2 positions. After everything she had seen and documented and presented with as much precision as she was capable of, it had come down to 2 votes. She told Vasquez, not officially, through the maintenance channel, which had become a private line between them that both of them pretended was probably not on record somewhere. 2 votes, Vasquez said. Yes. That's more than we expected. How many did you expect? 1, Vasquez said. You. Sorvith absorbed this. You thought I would be the only vote. You were the only name we had confidence in, Vasquez said. Everyone else was, she paused, variable. So what was the plan if it failed? The pause was longer. The plan was to make it not fail. How? By giving you what you needed to make the case clearly enough that 2 more people could see it. A brief silence. We spent 8 months preparing that presentation specifically for how you think, the evidence sequence, the metadata structure, the way the routing map is layered. She paused. We modeled your analytical style from 3 years of your published assessments. Sorvith sat with this for a moment. The humans had studied her, not the Dominion her, specifically, and they had built their entire approach around the question of whether she could do what needed to be done. What if you had modeled me wrong? She asked. Then we would have been wrong, Vasquez said simply, and we would have figured out something else. Something else, she repeated, with a Tier 2 military response incoming. We're better at figuring out something else than you'd expect, Vasquez said, and then, with a tone the translator rendered as mild levity with emotional sincerity underneath. It's kind of our thing. The formal discussions lasted 4 months. Sorvith was the primary Keth representative. Vasquez was the primary human representative. They built something together that had no precise precedent in the Dominion's 412 civilization catalog, which was, Sorvith came to understand, not accidental. The humans had no interest in fitting inside an existing category. Not because they were arrogant. Vasquez was, in 4 months of daily contact, among the least arrogant beings Sorvith had encountered in 40 years of service. But because the existing categories had been built by and for civilizations that thought in certain ways, and the humans thought differently, and they had understood this about themselves clearly enough to insist on structures that accommodated the difference. The 9 surviving Tier 4 civilizations were represented in the talks by the 3rd week. 3 of them had been unaware of their relay infrastructure's dual use. The other 6 had suspected something and said nothing because they had no framework for safely saying it. They had frameworks now. The Erath Collective refused to participate, filed 17 formal objections, and had 3 of them sustained by the neutral administrative body the humans had proposed, and the Dominion had grudgingly accepted as the arbitrating authority. Sorvith considered this a net positive. The Erath objections that failed were the ones that had mattered. The council member who had helped build the original relay system 30 years ago resigned before the formal restructuring agreement was signed. He issued a public statement that Sorvith read carefully, not for what it said, but for what it implied about how the Dominion's most senior members were beginning to see the situation. The statement was careful and regretful, and full of the specific language of someone who had understood something large, and was trying to find a way to hold it without being crushed by the weight. She recognized the feeling. On the last day of formal talks, after the signing, after the witnesses had recorded and the administrative transfers had been initiated, and the fleet outside had finally, for the first time in 4 months, made a minor adjustment to its formation. A small reconfiguring that Sorvith's sensors read as something roughly equivalent to a relaxed breath. Vasquez asked to speak with her privately. They met in the same room where the first delegation had sat. The table still carried a faint trace of the chemical signature Sorvith's analysis had later identified. She wondered if Vasquez knew that. "What happens now?" Sorvith asked. "For your fleet?" "We go home," Vasquez said. "We document. We send the full record to the 9 civilizations and to the neutral body and to 17 other filing locations, so it can't be quietly archived." "You don't trust us?" "We trust you," Vasquez said. "We don't trust systems to stay the way people who care about them leave them." She paused. "We've had a lot of experience with that." Sorvith thought about 31 civilizations, about the 22 that no longer appeared in the catalog as coherent political entities. She thought about what it meant to be a species that had looked at that pattern and decided, not to avoid becoming part of it, but to try to stop the pattern itself, to absorb the cost of stopping it, and to do so knowing the stopping would be imperfect, would require vigilance that outlasted any individual, would need to be documented and redocumented and filed in 17 places against the slow erosion of institutional memory. "You knew when you arrived," Sorvith said, "that the odds were not in your favor." "Yes," Vasquez said. "You came anyway." "We always come anyway," Vasquez said. "That's the part nobody models correctly." She stood to leave. At the door she paused. "Your dissent," she said. "The one you filed 3 years ago, when you were the only one who thought there was something worth paying attention to in how we behave." Sorvith went still. "You read it." "Our source forwarded it." Vasquez turned slightly, not a full turn, a partial one, as though she wasn't sure she should say the rest. "It was the reason we built the approach around you specifically." A pause. "You saw us before we were visible. We thought that deserved to be honored." She left. Her footsteps receded down the corridor. Sorvith sat in the room for a long time after the sound was gone, thinking about a dissent she had filed 3 years ago and considered a professional failure, thinking about what it meant that the beings who had read it most carefully were the ones she had written it about. She filed a new assessment before the fleet departed, not through the internal channels that had been compromised, through the neutral administrative body as a founding document for the restructured classification system submitted for the formal record. She kept it short, 400 words. She spent a long time on every one of them. The old system, she wrote, made predictions based on what a civilization could do. The new system, she argued, needed to account for something more difficult to quantify, what a civilization was willing to do, and when, and for whom, and at what cost to themselves, and whether they would continue doing it after the cost exceeded what any rational model said they should bear. She concluded, the Keth Dominion had better weapons than every civilization it had catalogued, better ships, better doctrine, better infrastructure, more accumulated strategic knowledge. There was no meaningful military contest between the Dominion and any Tier 4 civilization it chose to engage. And yet, she had watched a fleet of significantly outgunned ships hold perfectly still outside Keth-monitored space for 4 months, not because they were comfortable with the risk, but because they had decided the outcome mattered more than the risk. She had spoken with a delegation that came aboard in genuine fear and revealed none of it. She had been studied by people she was supposed to be studying. She had been found by beings her civilization had classified as pre-strategic, and she had been found by name, and they had built their entire critical operation around one person's willingness to look at evidence clearly. She had done her job. She had been seen doing it by beings who should not have been watching, from inside a communications architecture her own civilization had built. The final line of her assessment took her the longest to write, not because she did not know what it said, because she understood exactly what it meant. Every fleet in the Orion Arm had better weapons than the humans, better armor, better doctrine, better force multiplication. The math was not close. None of them, she wrote, had sent a frightened delegation into an uncertain situation and hidden the fear so completely that the only trace was a chemical signature invisible to standard sensors, because they had decided the situation was too important to let the fear govern. None of them had spent 3 years building a case inside an opponent's own architecture, before the opponent knew they were an opponent. None of them had modeled a single analyst's thinking from her published work and built a presentation designed specifically to give that analyst what she needed to do her job. None of them had come to the negotiating table with a disclosure plan already prepared for the event of failure, and held it quietly, and mentioned it calmly, and meant every word. The Dominion's fleet could destroy the human ships in the engagement envelope outside this vessel, probably within the first 40 minutes, accounting for their unusual formation choices and the tactical unpredictability that had cost the assessment board 3 recalculations. But the Dominion had not built the relationship with the 9 surviving civilizations, had not identified the source inside its own infrastructure. The humans had found that and told her, had not looked at 31 assessments and a survival rate and understood what that meant before anyone on the inside was willing to look at it. Had not, she wrote, been paying attention. The humans had been paying attention before the Dominion knew there was anything to pay attention to. That was not a Tier 4 characteristic. That was not a tier characteristic at all. The framework did not have a category for it, which was why the framework needed to change. She submitted the assessment. She watched the human fleet reform its configuration in the slow, considered way that she now understood was not inefficiency but deliberateness. Each adjustment communicated. She had learned to read some of it over the 4 months, in the same way she had eventually learned to read Vasquez's expression. Not completely, not with confidence, but enough to know that more was being said than she was catching. The fleet was going home. And when it arrived home, with its documentation filed in 17 locations, with its formal agreements witnessed and recorded, with Vasquez's full report transmitted to whatever authorities and councils and oversight bodies the humans maintained, it would begin doing whatever the humans were doing next. She did not know what that was. She had asked twice and received answers that were technically complete and left the actual question untouched. She thought she would learn, eventually. She thought the learning would follow the same pattern as everything else, more clarity about what was happening and deeper uncertainty about what it meant. She had decided she was not afraid of that uncertainty anymore. She had decided it was the most important information available. The last human ship cleared the monitored space boundary at 400 ship time, while most of the patients of accumulated authority *S crew slept. Sorvith watched it go from the observation port, the same port she had stood at on the first day, when the fleet was arriving and the stillness was loud, and she had not yet understood anything. The boundary was just space, just stars, the same stars that had been there before the fleet arrived, and before the talks, and before the filing, and before the assessment she had written and the one she had revised and the framework she had argued should be replaced. They were still there after the fleet was gone. The stars didn't change when something important happened in front of them. She had always known that, intellectually. Standing here, at the end of 4 months that had restructured something significant about the way the Orion arm organized itself, she felt it differently. The scale of ordinary space, indifferent to what small, bright vessels moved through it, and the specific quality of what humans had done inside that indifference. Not waited for the conditions to be favorable, not waited for the weapons balance to shift, not waited until the mathematics said survival was guaranteed. Just came anyway, scared and thorough and paying attention, and prepared to lose what was necessary, and absolutely certain that the alternative, calculating and waiting while something preventable happened to someone they could see, was the only outcome they could not accept. She filed one more addendum to the assessment that morning, 3 words. She marked it as a personal annotation, not an official position. They never stop.